Okay, thank you, everybody. The idea is that Neil will share with us a presentation or the beginning of a discussion. The objective of this meeting is to have an open conversation and to try to ask all what aprovechar the experience, take advantage of their experience, and of course to have a discussion on how the energy transition and the generation in the energy transition is moving on, and what we need to implement in our country.
Okay, so
it's yours.
I'll try not to talk too fast. If I do start talking too fast, slow me down. Okay. If you want to ask questions, just throw something. What I thought I would do is, for those of you who don't know EPRI, just introduce EPRI a little bit. So we were established about 50 years ago in the US after a major blackout in the northeast of the US. And the blackout was really as a result of the electric utilities in the US not investing in research and development. So what happened is the utilities came together and decided that they would form what is now EPRI as a mechanism to pool their money to do research together. And that is the model of EPRI. We bring people in to collaborate. So rather than every one of you paying for research individually, all pay together and then share the results. And we're doing about, as it says there, is it 460? Is it 500? It's between 450 and $500 million a year of R&D with about 400 companies. And we joke, I'm not American, Ricardo's not American, but people think of EPRI as an American organization. Yes, we're based in America, but more and more, as the energy transition goes on, as we grow our footprint, we become a global organization. So, which is why we joke about I'm American. We do R&D, but a lot of what we also do is we work with the financial community, the consulting community, media, policymakers, whatever, to help them understand the scientific fact, the scientific reality as we see it about what is going on. And it's never been more important than now. With the energy transition and so much change, we're very careful, though, we don't advocate for a particular political position or a particular technology solution. But we basically talk to it, the science as we see it. And that's what we hold very close, is our reputation as being kind of scientifically pure. Because it'd be very easy for me to sit here and say, well, nuclear is the answer to everything. But, it's not. It's a balance of all the different options. And that's what EPRI is trying to do, trying to inform people as well as doing research. This shows you the engagement of where we are. Obviously, the US isn't colored in because we have all of US, but then you've got Latin America, we've got China, Japan, Korea, Australia, South Africa, massive engagement across Europe as well. It shows you a real example of the countries we're playing in and the work we do. And obviously, the specifics of the particular work we're doing in different regions is a reflection of what their energy mix is. We're not doing nuclear work in Australia. We're doing nuclear work in China. But that shows you where we are, what we're doing. And there's people like Ricardo who looks after Latin America, but he has counterparts in other places around the world.
Bueno, aparte de Latinoamérica, tenemos miembros en Argentina, Brasil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, México, Perú. Argentina en particular con Pampa. Pampa es miembro de EPRI. Nucleoeléctrica Argentina, NASA, también es miembro de EPRI. Y Transener también es miembro de EPRI. Regularmente esas tres empresas son miembros de EPRI. Brasil, igualmente, ETN, la nucleoeléctrica de Brasil es miembro de EPRI. Petrobras, Engie, Eneva, Braskem es miembro de EPRI. En Chile, Transelec y ISA, ISA Chile. En Colombia, ISA es miembro de EPRI, Celsia, Grupo Energía Bogotá. En Costa Rica, el ICE. En Ecuador, SELEC. México, CFE. Y Perú, estamos haciendo un proyecto con COES. Entonces, es más o menos lo que tenemos en Latinoamérica.
Yeah. Okay, so just, you know, it shows you all the examples. Something I'll draw out there, Ukraine. We're working with Ukrainians on nuclear. So we're supporting Zaporizhia and countries and grants like that. Japan, we had people on the ground in Japan the day after the Fukushima accident. And for example, everyone hears today about the water discharge from Fukushima into the Pacific. We worked with TEPCO to design the system which is actually cleaning the water up at Fukushima. Those are some of the things we've done, which, you know, I'm particularly proud of. And we don't talk about it. We don't stand up and shout loud about what we've done, because if we do something, then we move on and do something else. And what I can tell you, the example about Japan is really important. We were able to do that because the year before the accident at Fukushima, we had done a research project on how to clean up contaminated water from a nuclear accident. We'd done it before there was an accident, but we had that work ready. We took it off the shelf and implemented it. And that's the big thing about EPRI. Our job is to look into the future and see what needs to be done and make sure that research is done before people need it, is a good way of looking at it. And that was one of our great successes. The book was there, we used it. Okay, we're a not-for-profit. So basically we have no shareholders, all money comes in, we spend it on research. The name of the game for us is not like a normal company. Our job is to spend all the money we have. Because if we don't spend the money, our members don't get the value. Thought leadership, really what I talked about, actually trying to lead the conversation. Independent, I talked about. Objective, scientific. Industry expertise and collaborative value I've really touched on. What we're seeing though, and this is kind of true globally, and I think it's a generational thing. Many of us, the older ones of us, have grown up in an industry where people have stayed in technical fields for the whole career, and we're used to an environment with deep technical experts. What we're seeing more and more is people aren't staying in disciplines as long as they used to. So you have companies who have people maybe 5 years experience, the most experienced people. Those people who have 20 years experience in a technical field, very, very few of them anymore. And it's a growing problem. We have a shortage of deep industry expertise across the world. And that is going to be something that is going to be part of the challenge of the energy transition, that lack of that deep expertise. And we're in a position where our job is we hire those experienced people. We have a lot of people who've come to us for kind of their second career. They've left a utility, come and work for us. We've got this network of these experienced people. And it's not so much the R&D role, but quite often what we're doing is helping our members by having those experienced people available to advise them as things go forward. And I can see that being more and more important as we go through the energy transition. I think I'll skip that one. I think we really covered it. So what do? We really carve up our scope into those 5 technical areas in the middle of the slide. Nuclear power, which I'll be honest, is my first love. That's what I've worked on most of my career.
And your wife?
Yeah. Okay, my wife may be my first love. It's just hers. Yeah. So nuclear power, EPRI has always had a big footprint in nuclear power. The founder of EPRI was a gentleman called Chauncey Starr. And if you were to Google Chauncey Starr, you'd find he was on the Manhattan Project. And you look at what he has against his name, one of them is the nuclear reactor. So nuclear has always been the heart of EPRI. Then you have energy supply, low and carbon resources. That is really the non-nuclear generation side. That also includes hydrogen production, includes energy storage, issues like that. Even down to working with the World Economic Forum on hydrogen hubs and things like that. You'll hear, you see it on the bottom, we've got a low carbon resource initiative, which is hundreds of millions of dollar initiative. We're working together across the globe on how to use hydrogen. And I can talk for hours on hydrogen, but we might get to that later. So in many ways, those first two bubbles are my area. That nuclear power, the energy supply, low carbon resources. And I mentioned I have a colleague who looks after the transmission distribution. You've got electrification and sustainable energy strategy. That's really that energy usage part. Big impact on electric vehicles. Many of the car companies work with us to figure out, now, what is the common standard for the plug electric vehicle in? What are the common standards for charges? We're in the middle of all that kind of thing. And electric vehicles are really interesting. I was saying earlier, I live in Charleston, South Carolina. My office is in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's a 200-mile drive. How many charges are there between Charleston and Charlotte? 3. So that is the problem. Even in a country like the US, the real problem with electric vehicle deployment is the charging infrastructure. And why would companies invest in the chargers if the cars aren't there to be the customers? It's the classic, what comes first, chicken and egg? What comes first? And that is the big issue, one of the big issues we're dealing with. Another thing we're finding as part of the energy transition, and this is a great example in the city of Charlotte. If you want to electrify vehicles, what is a good place to start? Taxis. Electrify the taxi. But then what's the problem? Where do the taxi drivers live? They don't live in the high-income neighborhoods with chargers. So you've actually got to have the charging infrastructure where the taxi drivers live. So there's a project going on in Charlotte about using the power supplies for the street lighting and actually have electric vehicles being able to be charged from the street lights because they've already got the power supply there. So there's a lot going on in that area.
May I ask you something? Because this is something we're really looking into, the part of chargers for the electricity for electric vehicles in the Secretary of Energy. So when you just said, were you talking about this specific place where you say that taxis should be the first to electrify? Because we're looking mostly at first at public transportation like buses.
I was just using an example.
This is an example.
We've looked at. I'll tell you one place to look for the best example I've seen, which is public buses and taxis, is Shenzhen in China. All their taxis, all their buses are electric. Their challenge, of course, is at night when they're all parked to charge. You think of the load and the way you've got to support that.
Exactly.
But that is an amazing example. Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong.
Might be difficult. Do I need to know Chinese in order to understand what happened there?
Yeah.
Is there any paper I can see maybe in English?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. Yeah, I'm sure we can follow up and help there.
Okay. And also, may I just say something for housekeeping reasons? Is there any way we would turn the heating off? Because I think it's, and I'm looking at it, it's right there, and maybe. It's not just me, I'm sorry about it. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Thank you. Yeah, I might expire. It's when I take the jacket off. Yeah. And then we have to transmission and distribution infrastructure. That is your classic distribution towers, the lines, the distribution infrastructure. But what we'll find, and we'll get to it later, through the energy transition, the amount of electrification is going to increase. The electric power, things are going to move from fossil fuel direct to electric power. And we're going to be faced with either increasing the load on the transmission system or building out more transmission, or both. So that is a lot more than just maintaining the existing infrastructure. That's what does the future infrastructure look like? And if you think about climate change, and we'll get to that a bit later on as well, what does it look like to underground transmission? What does it look like to underground distribution if the weather's changing? Those kinds of things. So a lot of work on the integrated grid energy services. That's the complicated thing about how do you manage this grid. You think of all this distributed energy resources. Think about if we got to a place where electric vehicles are actually supplying power to the grid at times, and the complexity of managing the grid is mind-boggling. Yeah. I wouldn't want to be an electrical engineer because, you know, that the flow of electricity and how you balance the grid, it's so much more difficult than it used to be, and it's going to get more difficult with renewables and everything else. And you start thinking about this whole concept of resource adequacy. What does it look like with renewables and fossil and gas and nuclear? How much capacity do you need? What do you need every day? You know, in order to keep the electricity supply there, because what's happening is through the transition, people are going to rely more and more on electricity because so much more is going to be decarbonized, vehicles, everything else. So people's expectation of reliability are going to go up as well. So people's expectation of reliability are going to go up as everything gets more complicated. So it's going to be really, really difficult to keep those two balances together. And then think about keeping it cost effective, which is that tie back to the World Energy Council, this humanizing part about, you know, what does it look like cost-wise? What does it look like just overall impact-wise, as well as doing all this technical work we need to do? So you can see that EPRI touches all of it. And the reason I like the World Energy Council connection is because that's all technology. It doesn't talk about the human side. And that, what we find certainly in EPRI is those conversations, people are comfortable having technology conversations, but people are really struggling on that humanizing side of it to actually figure out the impact. And then at the bottom, those 5 areas at the bottom, those are really some of our big initiatives, focus areas, low carbon resources. What does that look like for hydrogen, for sustainable aviation fuel? I'll tell you another story. I was in Japan again. I was talking to the CEO of J-Power. They have lots of fossil plants in Japan. So I said to him, well, what are you going to do to reduce your carbon footprint? He says, okay, we're going to convert our fossil plants to ammonia. Okay, that's good. Apart from ammonia kills people. Yeah, ammonia is poisonous. I said, okay, so where are you going to get ammonia from? Oh, we're going to get it from Australia. So they're going to pay the Australians to produce ammonia using coal. They're going to put the ammonia on a ship powered by oil, take it to Japan and burn it in their converted fossil plants. So the Japanese carbon footprint will look pretty low, but the Australian carbon footprint will go up. And I said to him, well, how about the economics? I said, oh, don't worry, the government's going to pay. And that just gives you a snapshot of some of the conversations going on, you know, about people aren't looking at the total life cycle of what they're trying to do.
Sorry, Nick, you speak about green or gray ammonia? Gray ammonia?
Yeah. So I think that is one of the things we're finding is people need to look at the total life cycle of what they're doing. Yeah. And I'll tell you another example, back to the humanizing example. It's in the background, all this transition is supply chain. You start looking at where materials come from. Lithium, as we all know, needed for EV batteries and everything else. Historically, lithium mines in North America shut down, all the mining went to China. Now what's happening is the mines start to come back to, because of the cost of lithium's going up. All of a sudden, people are realizing the environmental impact of lithium mining because it's in their backyard. So this energy transition is going to have a big impact on resources. I was looking at something with cobalt the other day, cobalt coming from sub-Saharan Africa. I was looking at, I can't remember which element it was. It was Indonesia, the fishing in Indonesia, having their fish stocks wiped out with the contaminated water from one of the minerals being mined in Indonesia. So that goes back to the technology conversation is one thing, the impact of the technology on society is another thing. And we're trying to get in the middle of all of this. So what's the research part of that? We're now starting to do more and more work on recycling. You know, the circular economy type thing. We've got to find a way to not just dig everything onto the ground. And maybe we're in Chile later this week. How much copper do we need for all this? And how much copper is there in the ground? And it's like, maybe we need to start recycling things. So human kind of brain power support the transition and the mineral transition, let alone the fabrication transition, going to be challenges. Okay, so some of what we do, as I said, our job is to look into the future because many of our members, many of our stakeholders, they're too busy dealing with today to think about the future. So we started looking, painting a picture of what 2030, what 2050 looks like. And you'll see going forward, the climate's changing. And you've got to be careful. What's the difference between climate and weather? Climate's the average, weather's the extreme. We're seeing extreme weather events. Used to be 100 years, now every 10 years. So what does that mean to the assets we have and the assets we're building? You know, what codes and standards do we build transmission to for the future? What do we do when we're playing? I tell a story about Florida. You sit here and see the US with hurricanes come through. Hurricane will roar through Florida. It'll rip down all the transmission, all the distribution. So what do? We mobilize thousands of people, go to Florida, and they rebuild the system exactly how it was the week before. Then next year, the hurricane whistles through, does it again. And we're very good at this. We'll go back in and we'll rebuild it just the way. What is the new standard we should build it to, which is probably underground? Yeah. I was on an island in the Caribbean on vacation 2 weeks ago. They had the hurricane went through 3-4 years ago. Everything now is underground. That is the way we may have to go. And it's not just wind, it's rainfall, it's everything else. So we're doing a lot of work, both with utility companies and insurance companies and other people, trying to understand what the impact of that future looks like. And it's actually not just energy companies. You think, cell phone companies, they've got the same problem. as people are relying now more and more on cell phones, the cell phone companies realize that they have to understand what's happening to the weather so they can actually build their infrastructure to withstand what's coming. So there's a whole undercurrent going on about what does the new climate look like in 2030, 2040, 2050. Renewables, there is going to be a massive growth in renewables. We did this analysis in the US about 5-6 years ago. We said the rate of renewables growth needed to triple in order to meet the demand for 2050. Well, we failed to achieve that. We're now hitting the stage it might have to be 5 times that rate because not enough has been done. So what we're going to start seeing is if we're going to hit 2050, we're going to have to really accelerate that renewable build out. And it's not the US by itself, it's Argentina, it's Australia, it's China, it's Europe, everything else. So in this time period, as we haven't moved over the last decade or so, we've got more and more to do by 2050. So where does it all come from? Where do the resources come from? Where are the solar panels going to be made? Is there an opportunity to help, for example, sub-Saharan Africa actually lift their economy by giving them a role in making some of these solar panels? I don't know. Are there opportunities to do something different to uplift economies on these renewables? Another great example of something we're involved in, offshore wind, is hard. But then you get the collision between legislation and technology. There's a thing in the USA called the Jones Act. The Jones Act is from about 1910, so that kind of thing. So all ships doing trade from the US have to be built in the USA and crewed by Americans. So before you can build offshore wind in the USA, you've got to build the ships to deploy the wind. You can't bring ships from Europe. It's amazing the barriers that are being put in the way. We have people talking about floating offshore wind. Think of the cost of floating offshore wind. Yeah, we can do it. We've done oil platforms. We know how to do that, but the cost is incredible. But if you're in Japan or Korea, that is really your only option because you haven't got the land area, which is why if you look at Korea, the current president's restarted their nuclear program because they don't have the land mass to do as much renewables as they want to. It's why you see in Japan, even after Fukushima, they've realized, you know, we need renewables, but we probably need 30% nuclear as well. So people are figuring out there's a balance. It used to be that people would think renewables could do everything. It used to be that nuclear people would think nuclear could do everything. What we're seeing is there's a balance between the two, and it's very country specific, regional specific. But one example I often talk about is the northwest of the USA, energy northwest. They've got a lot of hydro, a lot of wind, and they have some nuclear. They did an analysis. And once they get to about 80% renewables, that marginal cost of building more renewables doesn't make sense. And that's when, even with nuclear being relatively high, it actually makes sense to deploy nuclear for that last 20%. So every region is finding a different mix, and it truly is that mix of things. Then we see going forward 2030, electric transportation, as much as half new cars by electric by 2030. In Europe, it's probably more than that. And you get back to, you're not going to have the cars until you have the chargers. And how are you going to finance the chargers? That's why you see in the USA, the Inflation Reduction Act and the other legislation, it's freeing up money to get ahead of that, to actually for the government to subsidize putting the charging infrastructure out there. And it says, hey, more and more sustainable independence electricity. So that's a shot about what we see it's kind of US focused, but it's really applicable to anyone. That's what you see the next decade looking like. And that's the other thing that we're seeing. And it's really, part of it's driven by the pandemic and the realization that globalizing the supply chain that made people vulnerable. Another part of it's driven by the Ukraine war and people going back to energy independence and everything else. We've been in an area where industrial demand has been flat. What we believe we're going to see in the US is, as industries start coming back, industrial loads will increase. And this is really important for our members because they can now see a future where load growth is going to be there. So it actually gives them a background in order to invest in capacity. And there's other things going on. Just AI and this generative AI and the server load. We're seeing people talk about maybe a 50 times load increase for server farms. There's a nuclear plant in the northeast of the US. They've actually built server farms on this site. And basically their business model is they're producing, it's a nuclear powered server farm. So we're seeing a massive future growth in electricity, which is actually accelerating away by reindustrialization of countries with everything that's going on. So, all these changes at the same time, you think of the potential for getting something. And the something wrong is, maybe the grid won't fail, but are all the decisions that are made going to be right? How much are we going to invest in that was the wrong bet? Are we going to build something that doesn't work? Are we going to invest billions of dollars in carbon capture and storage and it doesn't pay off? Are we going to build massive amount of gas generation, then use it for 5 years, then walk away from it? That may be the big challenge of rushing too fast to 2030 and making the wrong decision for 2050. But the other side of it is there's a lot of people sat on their hands and not making a decision to do anything. So it's a very, very hard discussion making how much of that Inflation Reduction Act is going to be wasted investment. And that just shows you, this again is for the US. It shows you a little bit of the challenge the US faces. The green bar is the electricity sector. Shows the electricity sector has reduced its CO2 intensity by about 40% and needs to keep going down to between like 80% and 100%. But you look at the transportation sector and the industry and the buildings industry, really no work has been done successfully to reduce the carbon intensity of transportation or industry and buildings. That is where the real opportunity is. And that's where people are looking at things like hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, advanced nuclear energy storage, and everything else. And we can debate all of that. Hydrogen. What is the value chain for hydrogen? Because you're producing hydrogen using electricity. So it's actually by definition going to be expensive. So what's the value chain for the hydrogen? There are places where it's probably really good. My personal view is we might be in danger of over-hyping, talking up hydrogen to be too big a deal. Carbon capture and storage, yes, it's technically possible. My fear is that will people be willing to give permission to permit it? And then also, of course, some countries have the geology for carbon capture and storage, some don't. US is very lucky. US can probably do carbon capture and storage in the oil wells in the Gulf. But some countries have no geology for carbon capture and storage. Advanced nuclear, yes, but it's not going to be the cheapest source, and is it going to be available in time? I'd say advanced nuclear probably isn't going to deploy until the 2040s. Is that too late? So those are some of the challenges. Energy storage, yeah, there's options. So what we're doing at EPRI is understanding all of those to keep more on the table. I can tell you that is part of the problem. A lot of our members are sat waiting to understand hydrogen, waiting to understand the carbon capture and storage, and not doing anything. There's going to come a point very soon where people are going to have to decide to do something. And the way I explain it is, the infrastructure you have today is pretty much the infrastructure you're going to have in 2030, because it takes that long to build something. The investment decisions we're making over the next 10 years will determine what the infrastructure is in 2050. So the next 10 years are so important as people decide what it is they're going to build, because by the time they design it, permit it, finance it, source it, and everything else, you have to have decided what it is in the next 10 years. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. And you may think that's pessimistic, but you're doing it at the same time in Argentina as every other country in the world is trying to do it. There aren't the resources to do things necessarily at the time frame we thought about. So that is the challenge, I think, understanding what the reality of those technologies looks like. And this again just shows you an example of how long it typically takes to deploy these technologies. You know? So industry initiatives, I talked to them a little bit. I want to tell you, I may sound pessimistic, but I'll tell you, this is probably the most exciting time to be in this industry, because there's so much needs to be done. There's so many people realize what needs to be done. And there's frankly so much money out there to fund what needs to be done. You know, and I tell people, one of my first jobs in the Royal Navy was in response to climate change, was changing the refrigerant in a chilled water plant on a submarine. So my whole career, I've been dealing with climate change. And look how much difference it made, not much. So this is why I am so passionate about this, because I've had the benefits of all that climate impact. And our generation hasn't actually really paid the price for what we've done. So this is our chance to really dig in and do something. So you see there, EVs to scale. I've touched on it a few times. How do we unlock EV deployment? But you know, it goes without saying, you can get the chargers there, but the power to supply the chargers needs to be green as well. So what does that look like? Is it renewables? Is it small modular reactors? Is it wind or whatever? What does that look like? LCRI, low carbon resource initiative. That is the hydrogen, low carbon fuels, everything else. That's where a lot of work was on, this hydrogen value chain. And that, I think, is the key to hydrogen, is understanding that economic case for doing it. I'll show you a great example. There's a company in the US working with Dow Chemicals. Dow Chemicals use a lot of heat. Any chemical company use heat. So initially the thought was that these chemical companies would decarbonize by burning hydrogen, so that somewhere hydrogen would be produced, then the hydrogen could be piped to a chemical company and they burn the hydrogen for the heat. But there's now a high temperature nuclear reactor option. Dow Chemicals have entered an agreement with a nuclear company, just have a small modular, high temperature small modular reactor on their chemicals, cut out the hydrogen. So all these things are changing all the time. Then you see there system resilience. I talked about this climate impact, or climate ready. Understanding what that impact on the infrastructure of the climate will be. And I've really covered a lot of this, so just jump in if you like. Low carbon, direct electrification. What can we actually just go direct to? And what do we have to have indirect electrification? With hydrogen, ammonia, synthetic hydrocarbons. There is a huge amount of money being invested in that indirect electrification area. Things like the airline industry. What are they going to do for synthetic fuels and everything else? So we're not doing all of it. We're trying to find the right places to work. In many ways, you think about the collaborative model of EPRI. We can bring dozens of companies together to learn from each other. So we'll maybe do a test of a hydrogen-fired gas turbine, and we'll share the results with everyone else. So everyone's not doing the same test. We'll do something with, you know, transporting hydrogen. We'll share the results with everyone else. Working with the World Economic Foundation and Accenture on hydrogen hubs. So we're trying to find our role, not claiming to do all of it, but actually unlock this potential of hydrogen, for example. And one of the big things is electrolysis. It's expensive. And again, a personal view on the hydrogen. Most of the hydrogen we use today is made by steam methane reformation, basically heat and methane. Success may be, the first measure of success may be that that hydrogen we produce today through steam methane reformation, maybe we make that green hydrogen. That might actually be a very good objective. Eliminate the hydrogen load we have today before we even talk about additional uses of hydrogen. I think that is a realistic objective, is just get rid of that steam methane reformation before we go on to other uses of hydrogen. PwC, hydrogen demonstration, I've covered that really. Climate risk, climate ready. So this is really 3 work streams. And we're working with companies across the world, national labs, insurance companies, utility companies, whatever. And the first stage is, how do we take climate modeling and build a context where every company can take a climate model and localize that data? So it says, okay, this isn't just Argentina, it's maybe, this is what the climate change in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years in Buenos Aires looks like. And then everyone has the same set of assumptions. So it's consistent. So insurance companies look at it the same. It's not their model's different to their model to their model. So everyone's coming at it with the same context. So it's getting these scientists together to get the understanding what the modeling is saying. And it's going to be iterative. It's going to change as the weather changes and everything else. And we're having great success with that, getting all these really smart people together and talk about what this down scale of the climate models looks like. The second step is then looking at what do we do about that at the kind of the infrastructure level? How do you harden switch yards? How do you harden power stations? What do you do with transmission lines? So what are the technological options to deal with what that streams look like? Then the third stream that we're working with many consulting companies is, how do you prioritize? What do you do first? What's the most impact? What's the best way to deploy capital in order to respond to it? So that's really very briefly what climate ready is. And it says at the bottom, EPRI is kind of uniquely positioned because of that collaborative model. We're not in it to make money for anyone. We're in it to maximize the impact of the money that comes together. And it's actually a very exciting scope of work. You see, this is just shows you some pictures about things that's happening. The technical bases need updating. And I was in France last year, and we started asking them, how long does it take to change the grid code in Europe? Say you want to change something. 10 years. We don't have 10 years. We've got to change a lot quicker. Resource adequacy I talked about. This is another thing we're working on. What does this look like in the future? What does, on a day-to-day basis, adequate resources look like if all of a sudden wind is going to collapse or solar is going to collapse and the temperature might rise faster than we used to? This is a really big issue which we're trying to work through, the tools and everything else around what is resource adequacy. And one thing I can tell you is, as we look at the US, depending on your assumptions for hydrogen and hydrogen generation, in 2050, depending on how much nuclear is there, how much gas is there, potentially 4 or 5 times the generating capacity that there is today. Think about that, the amount of infrastructure, because if you're building out renewables with a capacity factor of 30%, and it's replacing capacity which can generate almost 90%, you need twice as much, 3 times as much of that capacity. So that is a measure of the amount of infrastructure that might have to be built in order to keep that resource adequacy in place. 4 or 5 times what we have today. That's a real wake-up call. Can it be done? Yeah. But there's so many things need to be thought about. Talked about that. Yeah. We really talked about that one. And this is another thing we're really kicking off now, the shared energy economy, trying to bring in everyone together. Part of what we all tend to forget is the customers. Actually trying to bring that customer thing right in the middle there, that customer engagement, so they've got the choice, they can actually understand what's going on. Again, it ties back to the World Energy Council work and everything else. You get the environmental justice comes in there. It's really, I think for so long we haven't thought about the customer, the impact of the customer. As the reliance on electricity goes up, we've got to think about what the customer looks like. And I'll tell you, we've got to think about what the market looks like. What does pricing look like? It probably looks different for different people. And so all kinds of things going on. EV to scale, I talked about. And this is really, I put a World Energy Council slide in. No, but this is important. You know, this is why EPRI stepped up to be, if you like, the host organization of the World Energy Council in the US, because we are so comfortable talking about technology. But the whole trilemma index, the World Energy Council, really brings the other side to it. How do we get that sustainability part, the equity part, and the energy security part together? And that is what's really been the powerful thing for us in this whole thing, connecting the humanizing side and the technology side together. And every country is different. In the US, it's a very, very crowded environment. World Energy Council, every country finds its conversation, finds its place in that kind of ecosystem conversations. In the US, there's so many conversations going on, so many different bodies. This is what has become our kind of sweet spot, this connection between technology and the trial and error phase. Because most of the energy companies, I say energy companies, I say even the airline companies, even hotel companies, they're okay about technology. They don't understand the societal part of it. And they haven't got a place in the US to really talk on the societal part. So that's really what we're managing to carve out in the US. And this is something that, working with the World Energy Council office in London, we started doing something. And Mike Howard, who used to be the CEO of EPRI, is now the chair of WEG. So Mike and I clearly know each other very well because Mike hired me. But we're working on this for the Energy Congress in Rotterdam next year. And the thought is, you'll be aware the World Energy Council's done body of work in Aberdeen, looking at the energy transition of the Aberdeen kind of area away from oil to whatever the future is. We've taken that principle and we're looking at some examples of what is being done in North America. We're looking in the US, we're looking in Canada, potentially even in Mexico. I haven't told you about that. And one of the examples we're doing is, people think of the US as being this really developed country. I'm not trying to say this. There are people in America who do not have electricity. You've got some of the American Indian reservations, don't have electricity. Navajo Nation in New Mexico, they aren't electrified yet, or it's just starting. So one of the things we're doing here is documenting that progress with a transition in New Mexico of the Navajo Nation to electrify the Navajo Nation. That's what we're doing. I'm going to capture this in this project, and the thought is it's going to be showcased at the council in Rotterdam. Another one is ComEd in Chicago are doing work electrifying disadvantaged communities in Chicago. Again, it goes back to the EV chargers, the truck drivers, and all the rest of it. Capture those kinds of examples. And there's other things coming along. And part of it is, again, so that people can learn from the mistakes of other people. So those are some of the things we're doing as the US member committee. And we've got, I don't know, it's 4 or 5 different communities now have stepped up and said they want to do this. And it's not just the electric utilities, it's the cities, it's the communities, whatever. Want to document what they're doing, document what the learnings are, what's gone wrong, what's gone right, so other people can learn from them. And that is it.